Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here, and my gracious thanks to the New Zealand Initiative and the University of Auckland for hosting me here this evening. I must point out, I travel around the world, and the New Zealand Initiative and the research that they're doing is pushing education forward around the world. So it is truly a world leader. And so it's a privilege for me to be here this evening. And so you're kind of mentioning that it's a cold Auckland evening, but this is cold. So I'm from Auckland University, which is, everyone always thinks it's in California, but it's actually in Michigan, in the center of the country, and it gets really chilly there. And so that's me on a typical February day, going to work. And my colleague in the course that Oliver mentioned, Learning How to Learn, is a fellow named Terry Sanowski. And Terry's the Francis Crick Professor at the Salk Institute in San Diego. And this is Terry going to work at his day job. So that's one of the great things about online learning. People always say, well, the students come from very different backgrounds. Well, the professors can come from very different backgrounds too. So I was shocked, though. So here I am, I'm just this Midwestern engineer. I was invited to speak at Harvard. I was a nervous wreck. And so I walked in the room, and I was even more nervous because it was packed, standing room only. And I thought, well, why are there so many people here? Come to find out that our one little course, made for less than $5,000, mostly in my basement by my husband and I, had on the order of the same number of students as all of Harvard's online courses put together, made for millions of dollars with hundreds of people. And now we have, 2.5 million registered students of our course. The thing is, I think what this indicates is that people are starving for new, well-researched, practically useful information on learning. And so that's what we're going to be talking about this evening, but I should sort of start things out by giving you a little bit more information about my own background. As it turns out, I grew up moving all over the United States. So by the time I was about 15 years old, I had lived in 10 different places. Now, there's one problem if you're moving a lot when you're growing up, and that is the fact that math is a very sequential discipline. So if you miss out anywhere along the way, it can be very hard to get caught back up because it's so sequential. So when I was moving from Lubbock, Texas to Chelmsford, Massachusetts, when I was about 7 years old, they were suddenly way far ahead of me in the multiplication tables. So I didn't like math to begin with, didn't seem to have much use to me. And so I just said, well, I can't do this stuff. And I kind of flunked my way through elementary, middle, and high school math and science, which really is ironic since I am standing here in front of you as a professor of engineering, and I am the real deal. I publish in top journals. I'm a fellow of several of the top engineering societies. And so one day, one of my students found out about my sordid past as a math flunky. And he asked me, how'd you do it? How'd you change your brain? And I thought, how did I do it? Because I was this little kid, and I love this picture because it is the last cute picture of me. But I was this little kid, and I loved animals, and I liked knitting and weaving and all that kind of thing. And I didn't know what I could do when I grew up, except it couldn't be anything analytical. And so I thought, what can I do? I always wanted to learn another language. I mean, I grew up in this resolutely monolingual household, and you can guess what language we spoke. And I just thought, wouldn't it be awesome? But I couldn't afford to go to college. But I found out there was one way I could learn another language and actually get paid for it. And that was to join the Army. So that's me, looking really nervous, about to throw a grenade. And if you knew how clumsy I actually am, you would know why I look so nervous. But I did learn another language. I learned Russian. I ended up working out on Soviet trawlers up in the Bering Sea. And I just loved having new adventures and seeing the world through new perspectives. So I also ended up working at the South Pole Station in Antarctica, and that is where I met my husband. So I always say I had to go to the end of the earth to meet that man. And that was 35 years ago, and we were so happy to go back to where we were married in Akaroa, New Zealand. So thank you so much. But back then, so I did everything that people told me to do. I followed my passion, I learned a new language, and then to my shock, there were no recruiters knocking on my door saying, oh my gosh, we just gotta have your Slavic languages and literature skills. In fact, nobody was interested in what my passion was, or except a few National Security Association. I didn't want to go that way. But anyway, so I thought, well, now wait a minute. I remembered the West Point engineers who I had worked with. And I'd look at their books, and it was like, now wait a minute, doesn't that look like a foreign language? And aren't I supposed to be open to new adventures and new perspectives? And I looked at all the career opportunities that were open to the engineers that I'd worked with. And I thought, well, why don't I see if maybe I can do something like that? And so at age 26, after I got out of the military, I went back to the university and I started with remedial high school algebra. And I slowly began climbing my way upward. It was not easy, but if I'd known then what I know now about learning, I could have made it so much easier on myself. Now, when that student asked the question, how did you change your brain? Well, I like to write, so I thought, I wrote him an email and said, here's sort of the basics of what I did. And then I thought, now wait a minute, there's some really interesting neuroscience that's going on when you're learning and changing your brain. There's a lot of interesting cognitive psychology. In fact, why don't I write a book about this? So I put together a manuscript, and there's a way that you can, there's a website called ratemyprofessors.com. I don't know if you have it here. But you can go on and you can find the names of the top, say, 200 to 300 professors of large classes in whatever discipline you want. So I tracked down the name of several thousand top instructors of disciplines like math, chemistry, physics, economics, psychology, over a dozen disciplines in all. And I wrote to them, and I said, would you be interested in looking at a manuscript? And shocking percentages of them said, sure, I'll look at your manuscript on learning. And I got some great insights. But there was one thing they said that I thought was really interesting. They would often give me all this information about the manuscript, but then they had this extra little paragraph at the end of their emails, and it was almost the identical paragraph. They'd go, but I do this one little extra thing in my teaching, and it really makes a big difference. But I don't tell the other professors that I do this because they would give me a bad time about it. What was that one thing? It was like this shared secret handshake. It was the use of metaphor. And you might say, well, what's wrong with that? I mean, why would other professors give a bad time about using metaphor? It's because you can make the ideas easy for students. So the other professors would say, you're just making the ideas so easy. That's why people think you're a good professor. But we now know through neural reuse theory that if you learn one concept, let's say you learn the concept of how water flows. That's actually quite a difficult concept. That's why babies play with water. It's really difficult. But once you get that idea down, then you can use it as an analogy for how electrical current flows. And yes, I mean, as electrical current models positive particles flowing this way when it's actually electrons flowing this way, and at a quantum level, it all breaks down. But whenever a metaphor breaks down, you just throw it away and you get a new metaphor. And in fact, mathematical equations themselves, according to the quant Emmanuel Derman in the book Models Behaving Badly, mathematical equations themselves are simply metaphors for what we're trying to discuss. So metaphor is a powerful tool indeed. Now, what I'm going to, so I talked to top cognitive psychologists, top neuroscientists. I myself have done research for decades in engineering and engineering education. And so all of these things are behind the course and what I'm going to be presenting to you here this evening. So let's look inside the brain. We know it's really complicated, but fortunately, we can simplify its operation into two fundamentally different modes. The first mode I'll call focused mode. And it's just what it sounds like. It's hopefully what you're doing now, focusing on, hopefully on the screen or on me. And that's how we traditionally think learning takes place, when we're focusing. But there's another way we think, and that is called, I'll call it the diffuse mode. And it is more like the kind of thinking you do when you're standing in the shower, going for a walk, riding on a bus. So your thoughts are going through your head, but they're more relaxed. They're not as focused on things. Now, focus mode is called by cognitive psychologists the task positive network. Diffuse mode is the task negative network, or neuroscientists sometimes refer to it as the default mode network. So to better understand these two different modes, we're going to use what? Yes, you are so smart here. And the metaphor we're going to use is that of a pinball machine. Now, if you're of a certain age, you know how a pinball machine works. And if you're not, all you have to do is pull back on a plunger, and a ball goes bouncing out, and that's how you get points. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this pinball machine, and we're going to put it right down on the human brain. Are you ready for it? Okay, there we go. Okay, so here's the pinball machine on the brain. And this is an analogy for the focus mode of thinking. And you can tell it's focus mode because look at how close together those rubber bumpers are. When in the focus mode, you often have patterns that have been laid there by virtue of the fact that you've already learned something. So let's say the students who were in my math class when I was 7 years old, they already had some multiplication table patterns. So even today, for most of you, if I said multiply 23 times 77, you'd either get out a sheet of paper or you'd maybe even do it in your head. And I'm going to turn the sound down just a little bit because we have very good sound here, don't we? There we go. Okay. So, and, okay. So what's going on here is you can see how that pattern, how your thoughts have moved along the pattern you've already laid. But let's say you already know multiplication, but you've never done anything with division before. So division would be kind of like this new pattern, but you don't know how to put that pattern there. You don't know where it's going to be. You don't know how to access it when it gets there. How on earth do you learn something new? As it turns out, what usually happens is something like this. So we get to New Zealand. My husband, what does he do? You know, he's beginning to drive on the other side of the road. So he's driving on the wrong side of the road, just for a moment, because he's really quick. He's falling back on these old patterns, you know, the patterns we use in the States. You automatically do that a lot of times. When you're learning something new, you revert to something you already know, which often means, at least in the case of math, that you can't get there from here. You start to get annoyed and frustrated with the problems because you can't solve the problem, because you're using the wrong patterns. So as you get more and more frustrated, what happens is you eventually close the book, and then you walk away. And when you walk away, what it does is it opens the diffuse mode. In other words, when you take your attention off of that thing that was puzzling you, and it really has to be off of it, then you open up this other way of thinking. And this way of thinking is much more broad-ranging. So you can think a thought, but it ranges much more widely before it hits a rubber bumper. And that's analogous to real life, where the neural connections in the default mode network are much longer. So you can't get to that focus mode, concentrated way of problem solving that you can in the focus, that you can be in when you're in the focus mode, but you can at least get to a new way of thinking about that problem. And that can lead you to the solution. In fact, we always thought learning only takes place when you're focusing, but no, when you step back and you're not focusing, the brain is consolidating the information. And this can be as an important part of the learning process as focusing itself. So learning involves going back and forth between focusing, diffuse, focus, diffuse. You cannot be in both modes at the same time unless you are taking certain forms of mushrooms, and I'm not advocating that here. But anyway, so what I'd like you to do now is I'd like you to try. Hopefully you might be sitting by someone who you don't know. If you are, that is wonderful. I'd like you to introduce yourselves to that person, one or two people, and then I'd like you to take 2 minutes out. So take 2 minutes now and explain the difference between focused and diffuse modes. On your mark, get set, 2 minutes, go. sense so far? What's that?
What was the date of your first book?
August 2014, August 1st.
And the first one in January 2015.
Okay, so if you hear me, raise your hand. Raise your hand if you hear me. Raise your other hand if you really hear me. Yay. Oh, great. See, this is the one thing about active learning where students can actually discuss things with themselves or with each other. You can get so excited about it that it can be hard to get everyone back on the same page. But part of this is, did you notice something? When we paused and you turned to one another, you were momentarily in the diffuse mode. So that allowed you to kind of relax and think a little bit more independently and creatively and to consolidate the ideas that we were just talking about. So for those of you who are professors here or teachers, it can be helpful. This is why, I mean, the whole answer isn't to just let your students talk to each other all the time, because otherwise, the teacher might as well not be there. But on the other hand, judicious breaks can be extremely helpful in allowing students to understand the material. Also, a very interesting study showed that they went and they just measured the loudness of a classroom. And that was directly correlated with the outcomes, the grades of that class. So the louder the class, the higher the grades. So you guys are clearly going to be superstars. But I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, we have this professor here. She's another one of these theorists. And she's, who has time to go back and forth between the two different modes? We have information we have to teach or to learn. And besides that, we like to procrastinate. I mean, procrastination is actually, you may be surprised to learn, it is, in my opinion, the biggest challenge in all of education. I hear from students all around the world, and procrastination is actually their #1 issue. So I think that we should spend just a moment or two talking about procrastination, just to get some insights on it. And it turns out that when you even just think about something you don't like or don't want to do, it activates the pain centers of the brain. So the brain, naturally enough, looks for ways to stop that negative stimulation. So here's what happens. You think about something you don't like or don't want to do, and you get this kind of unpleasant feeling. So you turn your attention, you funnel it onto something else, and the result is you feel happier almost instantly. You do this once, you do it twice, it's no big deal. You do it very often, and it can have severe long-term consequences on your life, your students' lives, your children's lives. And the thing is, you can even end up thinking that you just don't have the capacity to learn this material when it actually has nothing to do with that at all. It's simply that you waited until the last moment, and then it's very stressful, and few people can learn under that kind of circumstance. So I'm an engineer now. That means we cut to the chase. What's the most effective way for dealing with procrastination? The best way that I've found and that many people really, really love is something called the Pomodoro technique. How many of you here have heard before of the Pomodoro technique? Okay, so maybe a little over a third of you. For the rest of you, this is going to be pure gold. So, and for those of you who may have known it already, this is a good reminder for you. So this technique was invented by an Italian, Francesco Cedillo, in the 1980s, and it's so simple. That's part of why it's so effective, but it also uses very effectively some techniques that we know from neuroscience work very well to help you focus. And the first thing is you just turn off all distractions. So that means no little ringy-dingies on your cell phone, nothing popping up on your computer. You just turn everything off. You can't turn off a kid brother, but you do your best. Then you set a timer for 25 minutes. And then you just focus as intently as you can for those 25 minutes. Now, I have a timer on my computer I like to use. Some people have a Pomodoro app. There's an app called Forest that's a particularly popular app. But here's a typical Pomodoro sequence for me. I know I'm supposed to write this one part of a paper I'm working on. And I'm like messing around, doing anything but that. And I finally realized I better get this part done. So I'll set a timer for 25 minutes. I start working, and I'm working so hard. You would be so impressed if you saw me. I mean, sweat is pouring off my brow, and I'm typing furiously. And, and I'm so proud of myself. I look up because I want to see, I know I'm so close to being done. And I've just done 2 minutes of the Pomodoro. And my mind screams, I can't do 23 more minutes. But then I just do the Zen thing. I let that thought go right on by, and I return my focus to whatever I'm working on. Because the reality is that anybody can do 25 minutes. But now comes the most important part of the Pomodoro, and that is to reward yourself. So whatever you want, like I'd suggest 5-10 minutes, something like that. You can listen to your favorite song. You can get up and go have a cup of your wonderful coffee in New Zealand. Who knew? It's changed a lot in the last 35 years. Or you can just go out and go for a walk or chat with friends, whatever you want to do. But you have to take your mind off of what you were working on. And why is that? Because it allows you to go into the diffuse mode on that topic. It allows you to consolidate some of these ideas. So taking this little break is actually enhancing your learning. So now for me, what I'll find is, let's say I'm working on something, and I often will not turn the timer sound on. So I'll be working away, 25 minutes goes by, and I was hating the idea of working on this thing. But once I get going, it's actually, wait a minute, let me add this. And before I know it, maybe I've put an hour or two. So if I want to go longer than 25 minutes, I allow myself to do that. But I always make sure that when I am done, I reward myself, because it helps rewire my brain to enjoy the focusing process while I'm doing it. So learning is like baking a cake. It has so many different ingredients. So what we're going to do is we're going to touch on some of these very different ingredients. And I think we should now step into one of the most fundamental ingredients of learning, and that involves the neuron, which is the fundamental building block of the brain. There's about 100 billion of them. And I wish you could see your faces right now, because you can just see you going, oh no, this is where she gets to the really boring scientific stuff. So let's spice it up a little bit. So here we go. This is our metaphor for a neuron, and this is a space alien. And the space alien has legs on it, and those legs are actually dendrites. And there's little toes. There's lots of little toes on the legs, and those are called dendritic spines. And then the space alien, or the neuron, has what's called an axon. And the axon reaches out, and what neurons do is they like to reach out with their axons and tickle a toe of an adjoining neuron. That's what they do. So here we go. We've got our space aliens reaching out. One is reaching out and tickling the toe of the next neuron. And that's kind of all neurons do, is they send signals. So you can see here, there's a signal, and it's traveling along, and it jumps across this little gap called a synapse. And so it is more complicated. I will admit, we've got an electrical signal that's coming down to that synaptic gap, and then there's neurotransmitters that are going in between, and it goes on, but I'm an electrical engineer, so I get to win and just call it an electrical signal, and we'll kind of have done with it. But what happens when you're learning something is that neurons connect together. So let's say that you learn a guitar chord. Well, you're just learning to connect a set of neurons. Or let's say you are learning how to conjugate a verb in a foreign language. Again, you're just connecting a certain set of neurons. Whatever you're learning, whether it's a dance move or how to take a derivative in math, whatever it is, you're just making connections between neurons. And as you practice more, you are strengthening those connections. So this indeed, it was mentioned at the very beginning, Kuhlmann mathematics. Kuhlmann math is a really good way to practice math and help strengthen those connections. So that was an outstanding approach for him to be taking with his daughter. And when you practice and as you're learning, what you're doing is you're going over those connections and you're building and strengthening them. And so as you're practicing in different contexts, you're adding in more neurons. So you end up with a nice, strong set of links with topics that you know well. So since I've introduced this idea, I also want to just allude very briefly to that idea of metaphor. And I had talked about neural reuse theory. So neural reuse theory is you've got a set of links because you've learned one topic. Well, you can use that as a basis for learning something that is somehow analogous. And it makes learning go more quickly because you're using as a bridge that initial set of neurons you've already with the set of links you've already built. So what happens though? Now I don't know if this is, in the States we have this problem. I'm sure you don't have it here in New Zealand. What will happen is a student will come to class, they'll take notes, they'll even understand what the professor or the teacher is saying, and then they get really busy and they don't look at their notes for 2 weeks. And then there's going to be an exam the next day. So they haul their notes out to take a look at what they'd understood before, they suddenly have no idea what that is. Why is that? It's because in those intervening 2 weeks, those dendritic spines that make the connections, guess what? They were not used. So since they weren't used, your little synaptic janitor can just kind of sweep off those connections because, hey, we're not using them anyway. And that's why what you understood, even in class, can not make sense when you look at it after a while. So another interesting thing about learning is, so let's say you're learning this evening. So some dendritic spines are beginning to poke out during our discussion here as you're learning these ideas. But when they really poke out, when they really start making connections, is at night when you're sleeping. There we go. It's when you're sleeping that the mind is practicing, running along those dendritic spines in between the connections of the neurons. And that's what's beginning to strengthen what you're learning. So, in fact, we can see, this is a light microscopy image of a living neuron before learning and before sleep. And this is the exact same living neuron after learning and after sleep. And if you look, see these blue triangles. They indicate new dendritic spines that have erupted by virtue of the fact that learning and sleep have taken place. So this is why it's so important to space out your learning. You want to do, let's say you have 5 hours to study a topic. You don't want to do, 5 hours of cramming all in one day, because that makes a set of links that's not very strong, and remember that synaptic janitor can come by and sweep it away. But if you do 1 hour this day, another hour this day, remember that each night when you're sleeping, it's strengthening those connections. So this is why spacing out your learning, doing some every day, is so much more powerful than just cramming it. And this also explains why sometimes students who are very good students in high school, and they get to college, and then about halfway through their first semester of a really difficult class, they begin struggling. And it's because they haven't laid solid foundations. It's kind of a weak neural architecture because they've just been cramming, and it fades away, and then they find themselves struggling as the class gets more and more difficult. Another metaphor we can use is just the idea of a brick wall. So you lay a layer of bricks, then you lay the mortar, the bricks, but you take time and let that mortar dry before the brick wall gets too high. If you don't do that, your wall looks sort of like this. It's a very poor structure for learning. So it's almost a little bit like weightlifting. I mean, it takes time to develop that kind of muscular structure. By analogy, it takes time to develop a neural structure. This guy did not develop this kind of structure by just sitting there and working out the night before a meet. But because we can't see in our brains, we kind of think, well, it's all mush up there. Sure, we can cram the night before, and it works just fine. But it doesn't. But while I have this weightlifter up here, I do want to bring up another very important point. And that relates to the value of exercise. Now, we've known for decades that somehow, magically, exercise seems to improve our ability to learn and remember. But nobody could tell why that happened, except that very recently they've finally discovered part of what that magic factor is. And it's a factor called brain-derived neurotrophic factor. That's abbreviated as BDNF. And here you see, this is a dendrite from a neuron, and it's before BDNF was essentially sprinkled on it. Now, BDNF is produced in the brain when you exercise. So what's the magic about BDNF? After they sprinkled BDNF essentially on this, you'll see what happens. Look at this. Look at all these dendritic spines. They're just like, wow, I'm hanging out, I'm coming out here, I'm ready to connect into new learning. Can you see? It's a lot easier to learn when you've got dendritic spines or dendrites that have these dendritic spines on them, as opposed to these that have very few. So that's part of why it's so valuable to exercise as part of a learning program. So now we'll turn to another topic. So I realize I'm kind of throwing some things at you, but I think this one is actually, to my mind, the most fascinating and important of all. And that relates to working memory and long-term memory. And so working memory is kind of, it's like short-term memory. It's pretty close to the same. It's got a little bit more cognitive abilities. But basically, it's your ability to hold something temporarily in mind. So if I gave you the numbers 2, 4, 3, 5, 7, you could kind of repeat it to yourself and hold it in mind for a little while. Of course, I haven't repeated it, so I've already forgotten what that is. So that gives you a sense of what is working memory. It's something that's very, very temporary, and you have to really concentrate on it to keep it in mind. This is as opposed to long-term memory. So long-term memory is you got it in mind and it's there. So like your mother's face, your address. But working memory is kind of like this octopus. And why do I say that? Because it's in the prefrontal cortex, and it's almost like it can hold 4 things. It's got 4 arms on it. And you can see there's the 4 arms. And, well, they used to think that it had 7 slots, so to speak, so you could hold 7 pieces of information, but now they think it's more like 4 pieces of information. If I have not had my coffee yet, it's maybe 2 if I'm lucky. But anyway, so what happens is, so this is working memory. It's sort of in the front mostly, and long-term memory is more scattered around. But for our purposes, I'm going to say it's like a set of lockers, and the lockers have inside them sets of links, lots and lots of sets of links. And that's the information you've learned that you've stored in long-term memory. So what's going on when you're learning something? Your working memory is working really hard. So it's trying to put together that set of links. And once it's got that set of links kind of put together, well, then all you have to do is just sort of reach out with your working memory, 1, 2, whatever arms, grab that information and pull it into mind. And so this brings me to our younger daughter, Rachel. So here you see, so we're sitting around the dinner table one night, and I go, okay, I need somebody to model backing up a car really badly. And our daughter Rachel's like, Mom, I got this. I can do this. So Rachel, with this video, what you're going to see is she is, not long before, she had really been learning how to back up a car. And it was really hard for her. And so watch her little face as she's trying to back up the car. Look, does she look in that mirror? Does she look in this mirror? Did she look in the front? Did you, well, yeah, which, you know, and then off she goes into the ditch. Now just imagine me trying to do that on this side of the road in New Zealand. No, anyway, so that's the thing is, when you're first learning how to do something, it's pretty hard. And that's why her little working memory had a heavy cognitive load. And she doesn't have any arms available for anything else. Just try to talk to somebody who's learning to back up a car. They will ignore you or they will crash into something. So, but the thing is, once she learned how to back up the car, it's easy. All she has to do is think, oh, I want to back up the car. And then, whoop, she can just pull that right up to mind, and she's got a light cognitive load. She's got arms of her octopus that are free, so she can even think about, oh, well, should I, or is my seatbelt fastened? What's the song that's playing? And she's got working memory available for more complicated thinking. So when you're, you know, if you're, let's say you're taking a test, if you have prepared well for the test, all your working memory does is it kind of goes down there, reads the test, and it says, oh yeah, okay, that's what my professor is taking this idea and expecting me to link this idea. Oh, and this one's a tricky one. I've got this one there too. And if you prepared well, it helps reduce that feeling of panic and helps you to do well in tests. So they have found, in fact, that if you practice and you actively practice creating these sets of links, you will do far better on tests. Sometimes students will come up to me and they'll be like, you know, I really knew that test material way better than the test showed. I just suffer from test anxiety. And sometimes that's very true. Sometimes students do suffer from that. But a lot of times, like I'll hear from the classmates of that student that they don't practice, they don't come and do the homework together, they aren't really working on the material. So with them, when they're sitting down to work the test, what's happening is they're going, oh my word, and their working memory is going crazy, and they think that's test anxiety when it's actually simply that we haven't taught them how to learn effectively. So, the thing about experts of all kinds is that their common factor is they have lots and lots of sets of links that they've developed by virtue of the fact that they practiced. Now take one little sidestep into educational theory a little bit here, and you'll see what I mean. So I just want to allude to why creating these sets of links is so important. If you look at types of instruction, we can have direct instruction, that's what I'm doing right now. Or we can have student-centered instruction, which is the students, they work with the material, which we did somewhat when we had that one active session. So you can have low direct instruction, which would be, for example, student-centered approaches, constructivist approaches, or you can have high direct instruction approaches. Now, we can contrast this. Don't worry, this is the only slide that's like this, so then we'll go back to. This is after evolutionary perspectives on child development in education. We can quantify material by how tough it is to learn from an evolutionary perspective. So, let's see. Recognizing faces. Is that tough from an evolutionary, I mean, is that something we get a lot of practice with, you know, from an evolutionary perspective? Yep. Indeed, babies can recognize faces without taking an advanced graduate level course on facial recognition. But math, that's a different kettle of fish. That's something we didn't evolve from an evolutionary basis to learn. And so we can differentiate things by saying it's either biologically primary, that's something we evolved to be able to do, or biologically secondary, something we didn't evolve to be able to do. And as it turns out, indications are that sort of the easier the stuff, the more effective it is to have student-centered. The harder the stuff, the more effective it is to have some direct instruction. Now, there's other factors. For example, working memory and time. Those are factors too. So you may use direct instruction, but you can't use it all the time because people need to sort of take a break and they need to consolidate the information. So all of these are important factors when you're looking at how to teach so people can really learn. And I think it's important to realize that it depends on the kind of material as to what approach you use. If someone comes to you and says, direct instruction is the only way to learn, they're wrong. But if they come to you and say constructivist approaches are the only way to learn, they're wrong. So there's different approaches work for different people and different subject matters. So I also want to point out another paper that is very important, and the title of it says it all. Why Minimal Guidance During Instruction Does Not Work, an analysis of the failure of constructivist discovery, problem-based, experiential, and inquiry-based teaching. Now, you may say, what little journal did you find that in? But it's been cited over 6,000 times in the literature. I will point out a caveat with this paper. If you read through this paper, you'll find most of it involves mathematically related topics. So I think this is an important paper, but it's important to remember it's for a certain type of biologically secondary material. But so let's go back now. I want to say that some of our most powerful good traits are often said by people to be really bad traits. And an example of this is poor memory. So if you think that you have poor memory, I am here to tell you this is a good thing. And why could that be? So remember that we had that octopus of attention with the 4 arms on it. That octopus, some people have they have like 9 arms on their attentional octopuses, and they're really sticky. So when they get something, they got it, and they can do handsprings with this information. And other people, they kind of get it, they got this stuff, and ooh, shiny, something distracts them, and something falls out. But when something falls out, something else comes in, and these individuals, research has shown, are often very creative. So if you have a poor working memory, or your child or your students, just remember that it does mean you'll have to work harder to keep up with the Joneses and get that stuff into long-term memory. But you would not want to trade the creativity that it gives you. Now, another factor that people often say is, oh, this is a terrible thing, is slow learning. And so indeed, sometimes I'll be teaching, so I'll ask a advanced complex question about Bayes' theorem, and someone at the front, sure enough, as soon as the words are out of my mouth, oh, they got the answer. And you can see the rest of the class kind of sitting there thinking, what's in it for me? You know, because they're never going to be thinking as fast as that. And as it turns out, indeed, some people have sort of like race car brains. They can get to the finish line really fast. Other people have more like a hiker brain. They can get to the finish line, but it's a lot slower. But think about the difference between what those 2 individuals experience. Race car driver, everything goes by in a blur. The hiker, they can reach out, they can touch the leaves on the trees, they can hear the birds, see the little rabbit trails, smell the pine in the air. Completely different experience, and in some ways, much richer and deeper. Now, my hero in science is a man named Santiago Ramon y Cajal. And Cajal was a terrible student, had an awful working memory, couldn't learn things very easily at all. He was a problem student, kicked out of several schools, and yet he won the Nobel Prize and is now considered the father of modern neuroscience. And Cajal was asked, so what were your characteristics that helped make you successful? And he said, first off, he said, I was persistent. So lots of practice, creating those sets of links. So no surprise. But the second thing he said, which I thought was very interesting, was he said, I was flexible. When the data told me I was wrong, I could change my mind. He said, I was no genius, but I have worked with many geniuses. And the problem with geniuses is that they can grow up being right and being smart and not having to correct errors very often. And then when they do make mistakes as adults, they're not very good at rectifying and acknowledging they made those mistakes. Instead, they will find ways to intellectually justify how they were actually right anyway. So if you, like Cahal, are a slow learner who has to really work at things, rejoice, because you can sometimes see things that even geniuses cannot. So with that, I thank you so much again for inviting me here.
Thank you, Barbara. We have a few minutes for questions, and the way we are going to deal with the questions is via Slido. So I ask you all to take out your phones, log on to slido.com and type in the code 9250. You can ask your questions, you can upvote questions you find particularly interesting, and a few of you have already started it, and I'll just pass them on so we try to get through as many questions as we can in the next few minutes. First question for you, Barbara, is from the audience. Is there anything definitive your research can tell about how the use of technology can enhance or detract from learning outcomes?
Oh, well, so I have to, although I've done tiny bits of research, as have many thousands of people, I stand on the shoulders of giants. So what is being presented here today grows from the great body of fantastic research that people have put forward. So I think there's no definitive answer. There can be ways that technology is good and technology is harmful. I should point out that when cuneiform writing first began, so the first writing that began, 3,000 years or so ago, people were complaining about it and saying, you know, this new writing thing, it's going to wreck people's memories. And it kind of did. But so there's always trade-offs in whatever you're doing. But this is, I think, the first time that we've had this social media, mass social media, and cell phones that we could bring everywhere with us. And I think there's some increasing bodies of evidence that too much attention to a cell phone all the time, sorry about that, you're supposed to be entering in your questions, it can actually be harmful. So that's one of the things I love about the Pomodoro technique is it teaches you to isolate for brief periods, get off of social media, off of cell phones. And I think that's very healthy. I do recommend the book Digital Minimalism by Cal Newport, a wonderful book about how it can be very healthy, especially for kids, to not be online all the time.
Another question is, you mentioned the study correlating noise in classrooms with higher student grades. We had a question who produced the study, and actually, can you tell us more about that? Was it linear? You'd have to pop me an email, and I'd have to go and refresh my memory. I think, if I remember correctly, it was linear, but I've got it in my my EndNote storage information, and so I can look up the authors of those studies. So if you want to email me, just go to my website, barbaraoakley.com, and it says contact Barbara, and I get all my emails. It always sounds like official, like, oh yes, and she has 3 secretaries. And it's like, no, it's just I filled all those things. Do you have any comments on motivation and learning?
Oh, motivation is the holy grail of learning. There's so many people that are working very hard because how do you get a student motivated to learn something that they really don't want to learn? And the only thing I can point out now is a lot of times you have to get through the ugly starting stuff in order to start feeling the desire to want to learn whatever it is. So it's kind of like riding a bicycle. I mean, nobody in their right mind very few people are going to want to learn to ride a bicycle if you just think about oh, I'm going to fall down, I'm going to scrape my knee, maybe I could bang my head. I mean, it's a really painful sort of experience. But you often don't think about that. You're thinking about, man, I'm going to be able to fly down the street. And so people just kind of skip over the ugly phase of learning. But the ugly phase of learning is in a lot of things that you learn. And especially the more difficult the thing you're learning, the longer that period of difficulty can be. So this is why I sometimes think that when people are told, follow your passion, that's really bad advice. I think that instead we should be saying, broaden your passion. Because broadening means, yes, do what you love, but also learn some other things. Because often what is really going to be most helpful and what you may end up loving the most is not going to seem necessarily like it's really that great as you're first beginning those initial, falling off the bicycle stages.
What do we need to do to make organizations better places to learn?
Oh. Well, I think it's important to look at what we're doing right to begin with. And I mean, it is really, really hard to get masses of population learning well. And so I think we have wonderful schools with teachers who are, we're as trained as well as we can get, given the vicissitudes of ordinary, differences in people's personalities. But I think one of the best things that we could be doing now is teaching people more about how their brain works, how they learn. I mean, the ideas you have here, kids should learn these ideas. Isn't it weird that we have 12 to 16 years of education and kids never get a single course in how to learn effectively? To me, that's kind of mind-boggling, and this is not hard stuff. I mean, it isn't rocket science, and if you use some of the tools that we know help people learn effectively, like really nice visuals, a little bit of humor here and there. You use some of these things, it can make, I think, a big difference. If I could just share with you, I mean, I get overwhelmed. If there's one trade-off for teaching a large, massive open online course, is that I get lots and lots of emails. And I get a lot of emails from people saying, this has really changed my life. I was flunking out of an engineering program, and now I'm on the honor roll. Or I thought I couldn't learn a language. And it's really quite moving. So I think it's possible to make a big difference with some small changes.
The most popular question at the moment is, should we be teaching skills or knowledge?
Well,
demanding audience.
Yes, it is. The thing is, you need to be teaching both. So one thing that I didn't go into here, so if you can bear with me for just a moment. I cheated a little bit when I said we're creating those sets of links. I didn't talk about the fact that when you're learning something, you've got your working memory, it's putting those sets of links out in long-term memory, but in the middle, it's going through the hippocampus. So what's happening is you learn a fact, let's say 2 times 3 is 6. So you learn that fact, and it goes through the hippocampus, through the trisynaptic pathway, and off into where it's stored in long-term memory. You learn another math fact, okay? It goes off, goes through trisynaptic pathway, off it, and another math fact. Okay, so you're like, why do we have to learn this knowledge? We can always go look it up. Here's the reason why. When you take in all that data, it is not only going through the trisynaptic pathway, it's also going through the monosynaptic pathway. And so I know you're thinking, well, 6 of one, half dozen of another. But the monosynaptic pathway is the pathway that makes sense of things, that finds patterns. So if you're not learning those facts, you're not going to be able to develop a sense of the patterns. You're not going to have math numeracy. So knowledge is critical for, I mean, you can't always just go look it up. Would I know how to speak, French if I just went and looked it up on Google Translator? Of course I would not. But somehow people will say, math is really special. You can always just look it up. But actually you're crippling students' abilities to master and to see the patterns and develop a sense of the patterns if you're not also getting that knowledge in there. So skills, however you define skills, of course skills are important, but knowledge, without knowledge, you can't really go anywhere.
Which blends right into the next question. How do we motivate students then to learn for understanding rather than for what's in the test? Oh, well, so I gave up on that, and I, so what I ended up trying to do is, let's say that there was some key concept that I really wanted my students to understand. Well, all I do is tell them this is going to be on the test. And then they understand, then they really work to understand it. I mean, I think it's all in how you're presenting the material. If you're really excited about it, you're never going to get everybody all as excited as you. I mean, for me, I work in a campus that has a lot of commuter students who are immigrants. They're working 3 jobs. They're supporting their family, and they're trying to become engineers. It's really hard. If they're just kind of working to pass the test, God bless them. They're really doing a lot, even with that. So I try to share my enthusiasm and passion, but I'm also aware that if you try to hit every student 100%, you drive yourself crazy. So do the best you can. If you reach 80, 90%, that's great teaching. So. Since we're talking about your techniques, one question was you use a lot of visuals. Do you create them yourself?
Oh, so this is the next on my list of things to do, because I do think art is such extraordinary discipline. I do not create my visuals myself. I did some in the beginning, but I work with a very, very good artist and animator. And we've worked together long enough now that I feel like he can kind of read my mind about things. But I just think it goes to show that that teaching well is something that can very much benefit from economies of scale. And so the kinds of things I do, like what I have shown here, incidentally, I should mention, okay, it's available free. So just go to Learning How to Learn for Youth on Coursera, and these animations, you'll see a bunch of 5-minute videos and so forth that have some of the explanations I have here. Then there's the Learning How to Learn for Adults. Similarly, it's free. Just don't tell Coursera I'm saying this. I'm so glad you're, oh no, you are videotaping. Oh no. But anyway, just when it comes up and says that, do you want to buy this certificate, say no, and then you see everything for free. Also, you can send me an email, or I can send to Oliver my PowerPoints from tonight. So if you'd like to share them with your students, that I'd be very happy.
I've got a question from someone in the audience asking about the right intensity of exercise for B, D, and F.
Oh. So one thing I notice in studying the various literature about exercise is it always seems like whatever is that particular researcher's mode of favorite exercise, that's the one that they say is the one you should be doing. But there's no one verdict about what's best. There's good evidence that walking for 40 minutes or so a day is a pretty helpful. But oftentimes they will, like a little bit of aerobic exercise, but how much you do, it depends on what study you have. I'd say just a reasonable amount, it seems workable. For me, I like to walk, so I do a lot of walking. But just there's something called Google Scholar, and you can go type in exercise there and put in whatever your favorite, weightlifting, running, whatever, and then you can see the latest studies on that particular thing.
So we've got athletes in the audience, but we also have gamers. And one of them is asking, can diffuse time be cognitively stimulating? Does it require quiet time, or can it involve a highly stimulative activity like a computer game?
Oh, okay. Very good question. Okay, so you should know that there is a video game currently undergoing the process for FDA approval in the US as the first video game drug, so to speak, to help treat cognitive decline in aging adults. So video games, as it turns out, they can be really powerful in helping build, in fact, I have some slides, but I don't want to draw them up right now, but it shows there's like this one brain image, and it shows kind of like it's pretty strong, and that's the 20-year-old group. There is basically their attentional abilities. So it's an fMRI image. Then there's the 60-year-old group. It looks pretty bad. I mean, it's like, how they have the bright red. Well, this is like this blue dead thing. And then they have the 60-year-old that's been on video games. It's even brighter than the 20-year-olds. It's quite amazing. Action-style video games are very powerful in enhancing cognition. And they're working to develop it, but if you look at one of the recent papers, it kind of says on the side, well, we've got these games we're developing, but actually, if you really want something entertaining as well as helpful, go play some of the actual video games because they're more fun. So that's a very good question about the focusing on a game itself. So if you're focusing really hard on the game, what are you doing? You're not focusing on that other thing at all. So you are actually, in some sense, in the diffuse mode on whatever that problem that you were trying to work on, if you're gaming and you're really intense in your game. The one thing they do find, though, so if what this is really cognitively demanding, so if the game is really cognitively demanding, then this other part that's working to consolidate the information, it can't work very hard. It's like you're drawing too much off here. But if this is not that cognitively demanding, then actually it can be helpful. You're in consolidating and making sense of the other stuff you had been working. So if it's a really fun, kind of relaxing video game, yeah, I think it can be helpful. But if it's really intense and very cognitively demanding, I don't think it's going to be that helpful for the other thing you're trying to work on.
Okay, we've got another 20 or so questions, but unfortunately we're coming to the end of the Q&A time, and I'd just like to hand you over now to our hosts from the University of Auckland, who are going to deliver the vote of thanks. So thank you.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. Great questions.